Give me someone who actually belongs in this room." The VP's voice cut through the boardroom like a whip, cold and commanding, as he shoved a stack of briefing papers across the polished oak table. The glass water pitcher trembled, then tipped over the edge, crashing against the surface and soaking the man standing beside it. Papers fluttered, water splashed, silence followed. "No ekbaligi, no acknowledgement." Just a sneer as the VP added, "God, I hate when interns just stand there like furniture." But what he didn't know was that the man he'd just humiliated wasn't Intern at all. He was the CEO of the entire company, in disguise. That morning, floor 47 of Halston and Reed's headquarters hummed with quiet opulence. Conversations were hushed, shoes polished, windows clean enough to reflect the skyline of a city that had long forgotten who built it. In a corridor just beyond the executive boardroom, a man stood beside a service card, clipboard in hand, his gray company-issued polo slightly wrinkled. His guest badge read simply, Devon. No title, no department, just a name. But Devon didn't exist. The man wearing that badge was Darius Caldwell, CEO, majority shareholder, and son of the company's late founder, Harold Caldwell, who built this empire from a garage and a second-hand IBM. And yet, this morning, Darius wasn't here as a leader. He was here as a shadow, an observer, a test subject in his own experiment. It hadn't started as revenge. It started as curiosity. For months, he'd felt the change. Not loud, not obvious, but present. Ideas ignored until someone else repeated them. Jokes that left him out. Data questioned when it came from his mouth, then praised when rephrased by another. Every interaction polite, every dismissal wrapped in a smile. He couldn't call it racism out loud. That would be too strong, too direct. But he felt it. 1,000 invisible knives. So he disappeared. With help from his mentor Eleanor and his security lead Jerome, he stripped away his identity. He wore clothes 2 sizes too loose, traded designer watches for a generic satchel, and altered his posture, his voice, his very presence. For 2 weeks, Devon would assist with board logistics, serving coffee and printing slide decks. No power, no perks, just proximity. Inside the boardroom, no one greeted him. Not Kendrick, the chairman. Not Talbot, the regional VP from Texas. Not even Cynthia, the HR lead who had once praised his visionary leadership in front of a crowd of interns. They saw an assistant and spoke like no one was listening. "Let's hope the big guy keeps quiet this time," someone muttered. "He loves throwing those equity buzzwords around." Another voice chimed in, "Just give me numbers, not social justice sermons." Darius kept his head down, arranging nameplates in perfect symmetry, each syllable slicing deeper than the last. And then, the moment came. Mr. Talbot glanced over a handout Darius had just printed, the revised budget summary, and without reading more than 2 lines, flung it back into Darius's chest. "You call this a briefing packet?" he snapped. The pages spilled to the floor. Water splashed his slacks as the VP's elbow caught the crystal pitcher. Cold liquid soaked into his shoes, pooled across the tiles. Darius crouched down, collecting soggy papers without a word. Behind him, chairs squeaked uneasily. Cynthia hesitated. Jeffrey, the newer board member, stiffened slightly, but no one intervened. No one asked if he was okay. Just silence. The kind of silence that screams louder than outrage. Still kneeling, Darius felt it. Not shame, not even rage. Something cleaner, sharper. He wasn't here to be angry. He was here to understand, fully, just how invisible a man could become in a room he used to command, and how quickly those who praise you could erase you once they thought you held no power. 15 minutes passed. The board discussed projections, talent restructuring, budget cuts to mentorship programs he had personally expanded. Darius stood, quietly stepped forward, and adjusted the projector lens. Then he spoke, calm, even. "I believe the language on page 6 regarding the community outreach rollbacks is outdated. You're referring to last quarter's draft." Heads turned, Talbot narrowed his eyes. Did someone ask for your input? Cynthia, brows furrowed, checked her folder. Actually, he's right. That's not the latest version. No one said it aloud, but the shift was instant. The man they had ignored had just corrected them. And was correct. Over the next 20 minutes, Darius spoke only 3 more times. A misquoted earnings report, a correction on the South Asia expansion targets, a clarification on the department merger timeline. Each note delivered softly, yet undeniable in its accuracy. Jeffrey watched him with new eyes. Cynthia leaned forward. Even Kendrick stopped checking his watch. Only Talbot resisted, muttering that the help had gotten too comfortable. Darius didn't flinch. He simply placed the updated booklets in the center of the table. Perhaps, he said, it's worth hearing from someone who's been watching from the back of the room long enough to see what's being missed at the front. Then he stepped back again, as if nothing had happened. But the room was different now. Uneasy. Exposed. Talbot tried to regain control. Let's return to leadership restructuring, he barked, flipping to a chart. As I proposed, we begin phasing out unnecessary executive roles, including the eventual sunset of Mr. Caldwell's position. Cynthia blinked. You're suggesting we remove Darius? Talbot nodded. He's hardly been around. Legacy doesn't equal performance. Jeffrey cut in, his voice suddenly cold. You're out of line. He's the reason this company survived last year's collapse. Darius said nothing. Let them talk. Let them argue over a man they thought wasn't in the room. Then, without drama, he stepped forward and placed a single black folder on the table. No one touched it. On the front, Darius Caldwell in silver emboss. Jeffrey's eyes darted to it, then to Devon, then back again. The realization hit like thunder behind his face. Darius raised his gaze. Finally, full height, calm, unshakable. He looked straight at Talbot and said quietly, You wanted someone who belonged in this room. He let the moment hang. Let every breath thicken the silence. Good news. He's been here the whole time. Long before he ever walked into that boardroom, disguised as Devon, Darius Caldwell had already learned how to survive invisible wounds. Microaggressions didn't strike like thunder. They didn't announce themselves. They slipped into conversations, into glances, into the soft edges of someone else's voice. A joke that wasn't quite a joke. A compliment with conditions. A hesitation so subtle it left no fingerprints, but somehow still bruised. He remembered his first quarterly review as acting CEO. Seated at the head of the table his father had once built with his own hands. The air was thick with performance metrics and polite smiles. Kendrick, the chairman, leaned over and said, Impressive numbers, your father would be proud. Darius nodded, expression calm. But inside, something flickered. Not a word about his own leadership. Not a mention of vision, or initiative, or risk. Just lineage. Like success had a last name, and he was only borrowing it for the day. At first, he dismissed it. Thought it was generational. An old-school compliment. Until it started happening again. And again. One meeting, he proposed shifting part of the firm's reserve into sustainable infrastructure, data-backed, long-view thinking. There was silence. Then Talbot chuckled, low and condescending. That's cute. Let's not play SimCity with real capital. Minutes later, the same idea came back, repackaged by someone older, someone paler, and suddenly it was genius. Darius said nothing. He learned a quiet truth that day. Brilliance didn't matter in that room unless it came from the right mouth. There were moments that still haunted him, small but sharp, like the merger strategy session with partners from Milan. He arrived early to test the AV system. A young consultant walked in, saw him alone, and said, Oh good, you're here. Could you bring in 3 coffees for the guests? Black, no sugar. Darius didn't correct him. He got the coffee, sat through the meeting, closed the deal. Weeks later, when that same consultant sat across from him in a performance review and realized who he was, the man paled. Wait, that was you. Darius only nodded. Yes, The intern with the coffee. The man stammered, apologized. But Darius didn't flinch. He'd already filed that moment in the same drawer as all the others. The time someone asked him to lower his voice, though he had barely spoken above a whisper. The meeting where a client mistook him for an assistant and asked if the actual decision-maker was arriving soon. The PR executive who pulled him aside after a media shoot and said, "Let's not put you front and center in the next campaign," just to avoid confusing a brand. He didn't yell. He didn't rage. He adapted. Every time it happened, he adjusted, not to avoid conflict, but to survive in its absence. Over time, he started second-guessing his own instincts. He'd look over slides 3 times, not because they were wrong, but because he knew someone would find a way to make them feel wrong. He started dressing more muted, speaking less in first rounds, letting others echo him so the idea would land. He smiled more, nodded more, until one day, he realized the version of himself sitting at the head of the table was no longer him, just a shadow with better posture. But the worst part wasn't the comments. It wasn't the laughter or the dismissals or even the silence. It was the erosion, the slow, steady wearing away of belief. Not in the company, in himself. He began to wonder, not loudly, just in the quiet spaces of his own mind, whether he actually deserved to be there. Whether maybe they were right. Whether maybe he was too young, too bold, too much. That's what microaggressions do. They don't just bruise your reputation. They bruise your reflection. And no spreadsheet can measure the damage of looking in a mirror and feeling smaller. That's when something in him snapped. Not like a branch breaking, but like a lock clicking open. If they only saw him when he was silent, then maybe that's how he needed to re-enter the room. Not as a man to be admired, but as one to be ignored and watched. That's when he created Devon. A role, a costume, a question mark. He didn't wear the suit. He wore invisibility because he didn't want their apology. He wanted their truth. And people only tell the truth when they think no one who matters is listening. So he stopped mattering, on purpose, because the only way to see through a room's soul is to vanish inside its silence. The more Darius listened, the more he realized his story wasn't just his own. It was a frequency. And once you tuned into it, you heard it everywhere. The hesitation in someone's voice before introducing a black colleague in a room of senior executives. The way diversity initiatives were celebrated at press events, but whispered about with rolled eyes and private calls. The casual way certain ideas were labeled bold when they came from white voices and aggressive when spoken by black ones. It wasn't just Darius enduring this. It was a pattern, a culture dressed up as professionalism but built on proximity to comfort. And black leadership, no matter how well-spoken or highly credentialed, made certain people uncomfortable. You began to speak privately with others. Black women in marketing who were told to smile more in client meetings. A senior engineer who'd been passed over 3 times for promotion because he didn't connect well with the team, even though his department led in performance. A legal counsel who always had to prove she was a lawyer because people kept mistaking her for the paralegal. They weren't bitter. They were tired of explaining, tired of shrinking themselves to fit rooms that were designed without them in mind, tired of surviving systems that pretended they didn't exist, or worse, that they were lucky to be allowed in at all. One woman, a vice president in HR, said it best, "We're not allowed to be excellent and human at the same time. The moment we show emotion, it's a problem. The moment we push back, it's defiance. But if we're quiet, we're invisible. So what do? We walk a tightrope, and the wind is always blowing." Darius felt those words settle in his chest, like truth poured into stone. This wasn't about his ego anymore. It was about the architecture, the way corporate environments whispered messages black professionals couldn't afford to ignore. Tone yourself down. Don't stand out. Be grateful. Don't challenge. Play safe. Never too loud, never too smart, never too ambitious unless someone else says it first. And the numbers backed it up. Studies from Harvard Business Review showed that black professionals were promoted at significantly lower rates, despite equal or higher performance evaluations. Gallup data revealed that nearly 60% of black employees reported feeling like they had to code switch, altering how they speak, behave, or express themselves to be accepted. And according to the Center for Talent Innovation, nearly 1 in 3 black professionals reported being mistaken for administrative or custodial staff, regardless of their title or attire. These weren't just statistics. They were shadows of lived experiences. Proof that what Darius had lived in silence wasn't an anomaly. It was a language, one the system had taught too well, and most companies refused to unlearn. What hit hardest wasn't the data, it was the emotional cost. Because over time, those small moments of dismissal, the polite condescension, the glazed over eyes during presentations, they didn't just erode morale. They robbed people of clarity, of conviction. You started questioning yourself instead of the system. You wondered if maybe you really were too sensitive or reading into things. You became fluent in second-guessing, and that language, fluent in self-doubt, was passed on in hallways, in elevator glances, in exit interviews that never made it to the boardroom. Black excellence wasn't enough. Black endurance became the prerequisite. And yet, in all that quiet exhaustion, Darius saw something else. Something dangerous, but also powerful. There were black professionals still standing, still showing up, still carrying more weight than their job descriptions ever listed, still mentoring the interns, still fixing the unspoken messes, still being twice as prepared for half the recognition. And that resilience was both a tragedy and a triumph. Tragic that it was necessary, triumphant that it endured. That's why this mattered. Why his disguise, his silence, his active observation wasn't just personal. It was surgical, because unless someone pulled back the curtain, the performance would continue, and the applause would keep going for the wrong actors. Darius didn't want pity. He didn't want praise. He wanted change. The kind that didn't fit into press releases. The kind that made people shift in their seats, not just nod their heads. The kind that made boardrooms rethink what power looked like. And you gotta own it without having to disappear first. Change never begins with noise. It begins with noticing. And Darius had noticed everything. Every pause, every look, every unspoken hierarchy reinforced with a smile. But the question wasn't whether the system was flawed. It was what to do once you saw the flaw clearly. And Darius knew silence was no longer an option, because the real power in leadership isn't in commanding attention. It's in deciding what you do with it once you have it. And now that he'd seen what they truly thought when they believed he wasn't in the room, the next step had to be intentional, precise, and public. He didn't storm into his office. He didn't call for resignations. That wasn't his style. He gathered the board 1 week later. Same room, same chairs, but a very different tone. This time, there were no coffee trays, no guest badges. Darius entered in full view, dressed in charcoal gray tailor confidence. Eyes sharp, calm, deliberate, and when he spoke, there was no trace of the assistant they once ignored, only the leader they had underestimated. He thanked them first for their candor, for their honesty when they thought no one important was listening, and then he laid it out. What he'd seen, what he'd heard were all meant, not just about them, but about the culture they'd let grow unchecked. He didn't accuse. He illustrated. He showed them transcripts, patterns, microaggressions cataloged, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. This isn't a reckoning, he told them. It's a reveal. And now that you've seen what it looks like from the other side of the room, you don't get to look away. That day, Darius introduced a new initiative, one that wouldn't be hidden behind DI statements or glossy brochures. He called it the third chair policy. From that point forward, every executive meeting would include one anonymous rotating observer, someone from operations, engineering, community outreach, or HR, not to contribute but to witness, to listen, and afterward provide raw, unfiltered feedback directly to leadership. You lead differently, he said, when you know someone's watching who doesn't owe you anything. The room was quiet, but not defensive. Some nodded, some fidgeted, but no one could deny the brilliance of the simplicity. He also made mandatory storytelling sessions part of senior training. Not slideshows or checklists, but lived narratives. Black professionals across departments were invited, voluntarily and paid, to share real accounts of moments that hurt, inspired, or revealed hidden truths. Not every story ended with triumph. Some ended in silence. But those stories were the ones that changed the most hearts. Because numbers don't change culture. Stories do. Still, Darius didn't stop there. He changed hiring panels to include cross-functional voices, not just by rank but by lived perspective. He brought in outside equity consultants to audit performance evaluations, not to punish managers, but to uncover patterns even they couldn't see. He ensured every leadership offsite included at least one facilitated conversation about bias, the kind that made people squirm before they grew. And slowly, things began to shift. Conversations got messy, but more honest. Promotions started to reflect performance, not proximity. Employees began speaking up, not because they had to, but because they trusted someone would listen. And the most important shift, people no longer looked at black colleagues like symbols. They saw them as experts, as leaders, as necessary, not just included, but vital. Darius never pretended the work was done. Real change is never tidy. It's loud. It's awkward. It stings. But he believed something deeply, that healing doesn't begin with apology. It begins with accountability. And accountability starts when the people in power stop asking for comfort and start asking better questions. And so, every time he walked into that boardroom from that day forward, he did it not as the man who had once been ignored, but as the man who had seen behind the curtain and refused to pretend the stage was clean. He never told the board this part, but in the silence of his own home, after the meetings, after the policy drafts, after the public statements, Darius would sometimes sit alone with a question that still haunted him. How many others stayed quiet because no one ever looked their way? Because he knew now, without a doubt, how many voices had gone unheard, how many careers had dimmed under the weight of being constantly second-guessed, and not all of them had a boardroom to come back to. Not all of them got the chance to remove the disguise. That's why this wasn't just about corporate training, or promotion equity, or annual review reforms. This was about dignity, about reclaiming the space between silence and presence, and choosing not to vanish when a room goes cold. That's why Darius now speaks, not to retell his pain, but to remind others, you're not imagining it. You're not alone. You're not too sensitive. You are not overreacting. You've simply been navigating a world designed to make you question your own clarity. And clarity, once you reclaim it, is power. If you've ever been passed over, not because you weren't good enough, but because you didn't match someone's picture of leadership, if you've ever been complimented for being surprisingly articulate, if you've ever been told to wait your turn, shrink your space, adjust your tone, hide your truth, then this story is also yours. Darius knows the cost of silence, but he also knows the power of story. So he invites you, not just to listen, but to speak. Share what you've seen, share what you've felt, because microaggressions lose their grip when they are named, and systems don't bend unless the weight of lived truth pushes against them. Start at your dinner table, at your team meeting, in your next hiring panel. Start where you are, and start messy. You don't need perfect language, just real ones. And if you're someone with power, the kind that sets agendas, opens doors, reviews resumes, ask yourself not, what have I done, but what can I change? Because change is not about guilt, it's about courage. And courage is contagious. The truth is, this story could have ended in bitterness, in resignation, in quiet compliance. But Darius chose another ending, one that begins again with each person willing to see, speak, and shift. So now the question is no longer, who belongs in this room? It's, what kind of room are we building? And who are we building it for? The answer starts with you.